climate change. Actually, the evidence now is it is going to affect you. And so whether it be to do with heat inland or rising sea levels on the coast, I think it will be significant if the US shifts its position, and it certainly seems the administration want to, although I recognize it's still a very divisive political issue.
It is a difficult political issue in the U.S. What's interesting about the Paulson and others report is that it takes a really economic approach to it, sort of this is a risk, just like you said. There's a risk of heart attack. There's a risk that you insure against if something might happen in your businesses. So they're taking a slightly different approach.
One of the things I did when I was Secretary of State for the Environment was set up something called the Stern Review. Nicholas Stern was a former managing director of the World Bank, and he did the costings on how much is climate change going to cost us and how much would it cost to prevent. And actually, he showed over a 15-year period, you get a return. It's actually a positive investment, not a negative investment.
Right. Interesting. And you, at the IRC, I guess you're not looking at the causes of what creates the humanitarian crises, and sometimes the causality is not very clear, like the massive floods in Pakistan several years ago that displaced 10 million people, or some outrageous number like that. It's arguably climate change. It's arguably not. So you don't look at those causes. You just deal with it.
Well, it's interesting, though.
Result.
I think we can look at prevention of displacement. So we're not a group of scientists, so it's not our... And anyone would tell you, don't pin everything on one event. There's clearly more extreme weather, which many people would say is climate-related. But what we can think about is if there's going to be a flood, what can you do to limit the damage? And that's obviously something that's being thought about in wealthier countries. I mean, I live in New York now. It's obviously being thought about after Hurricane Sandy. How do you insulate, to use your phrase, the city and the state from extreme weather conditions? But that applies as much in the developing world, if not more so. Now, not many people will remember that 6 weeks ago there were some very significant floods in India. 50 people were killed, which is a lot of people. However, in the equivalent floods 4 years ago, 14,000 people were killed.
Right.
So, and to a significant extent, that reduction in the in mortality is the product of investment that's been made to try to contain floodwaters, etc. So they call it in the humanitarian sector disaster risk reduction, which is not a very digestible phrase, but essentially, if you're asking me, is it possible to get upstream on some of these disasters? Is it possible to try to mitigate some of the worst effects? Yes, it is. It's easier to think about that in respect of climate-related events than man-made disasters that are political. And that's much more tricky.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. We have some great questions